This is Tirana's AcreForward, the ag industry's most thought-provoking podcast. Listen to interesting people as we go in-depth into the issues affecting crop advisors, growers, and farm communities, uncovering the truth about the ag business and using technology to prepare for the unforeseeable. Ready to explore the future? Let's dig in.
It's Mike, and in this episode here at the AcreForward podcast, really excited to have the only other podcast and the first one to come up when you search for the word AcreForward to use the phrase AcreForward since we started. So I'm joined here, and you're going to know him. He has a great podcast. He's very prolific and well-known in the industry. Mr. Chip Flory. Mr. Chip Flory, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here today on the AcreForward podcast.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot to talk about, and obviously between the two of us, we're probably going to more than fill the hour, but let's get to a few points. I want to learn a little bit more about who you are. For those that are tuning in, I'm sure many know. But before we do this, I want to tease the episode. We're going to talk about a magic or a golden or a core number when it comes to crop tour. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll, when we wrap up the conversation about the crop tour and the Pro Farmer crop estimate, I'll let you know what I think is the most important number. One number. The most important number that we'll get from crop tour this year.
So 2 hosts on this podcast is going to get you to one number that you need to know if you're subscribed and listening to AcreForward. No, that's really great. So you joined Pro Farmer as a floor reporter for Future World's News in 98, right? So Iowa State, all this. So first of all, what is Pro Farmer? What are futures, floor trading? Help us understand kind of how did Chip Flory get started on the road to this magic number around crop tour and Pro Farmer?
Okay. Finished up you know what? I have to go all the way back to 1981 where this thing started because I was a sophomore in high school. I was driving down the road with my dad, and Pro Farmer at the time had something that was called the Pro Farmer Minute, and it was on radio. And actually, the editor at Pro Farmer that put it together is Ron Michelson, who just happens to be Davis Michelson's dad. And Davis is my news anchor on AgriTalk now. But we're driving down the road. The Pro Farmer Minute comes on. And it was a tough time for the Flory farm in 1980 and 1981. It really was. And Dad was doing everything that he could to manage the risk that was associated on the farm. And he heard something in that Pro Farmer Minute that made him stop, turn the truck around, go back to the house, make some phone calls. And when he came back out and it was time to go back in on that parts run, he felt he sounded more confident to me. He acted more confident. And basically what he had done at that time was he had set the price on corn and soybeans because this was something that, he'd been waiting for the right message to get that done. And he got that message from the Pro Farmer Minute on radio. That left an impression on me, Mike. That really did. And from that point forward, Pro Farmer was something that I was thinking about and wanted to be a part of somehow, some way, someday. And I mean, I even went to college, Iowa State University, with the idea that when I'm done with this thing, someday I'm going to be the editor at Pro Farmer. So I'm going to, kind of create a curriculum for me that is going to work best for me at Iowa State and put me in the best position for that. So I talked to one of the editors up there at Pro Farmer, Bob Kaufman, before I left for school. And I said, if I want your job someday, what should I be doing? And we talked through it. And believe it or not, finals week of my senior year, my last semester, Bob Kaufman called me just to check up and see how things are going. He claimed that they didn't have a space for me at Pro Farmer at that time, but that we needed to stay in touch. the next day I get a call from these guys at Futures World News, and they needed a floor reporter covering the commodity markets at the Chicago Board of Trade and the grain markets in particular. I had a job kind of lined up and ready to go in broadcasting.
Yeah.
But boy, I tell you what, I jumped to that opportunity, spent 3.5 years in Chicago at the floor of the Board of Trade. And that's where risk management, the commodity markets, trading really got its way into my DNA now. It was an exciting period because I came out of 4-H. I was big in 4-H. I was all about setting goals and putting down markers and, doing all of that stuff so that I could check my progress. And it felt like, hey, things are working. I feel like at some point, someday, I am going to be the editor at Pro Farmer. Well, turned out that I was then for 17 years.
17 years.
17 years I was the editor of Pro Farmer from 1997 until 2014.
Wow, that's amazing to know what you want to do and to have something affect you so personally that carved out a career and made a path to see that through. That's fantastic. So,
well, it certainly left me passionate about it, Mike.
Yeah,
that's the thing. You've got to be able to source. You've got to be able to track a source of passion, and sometimes go back to that source and understand it again, and realize that you got here because, number one, you wanted to get here. Number two, because this is something that you are truly passionate about.
Why are you so passionate about Futures, Pro Farmer, now going to Farm Journal and communicating? Being a good messenger, I understand, but why are you so passionate about doing these roles, being a journalist, hearing? Why?
Yeah, like I said, in 1980, 1981 was not a good time on the Flory farm in Jones County, Iowa. There was a farm sale in December of 1980. I was 15 years old, but boy, I can remember it, clearly. And it was because of coming through the farm crisis. My brother is older than I am, and he and my dad were trying to buy a farm. In 1978, 1979, everything was still going okay. It was a diversified farm. It was a successful farm, and we were making payments. But when they changed the rules in 1980, and the idea became, if a farm or a business is so upside down that a bank can't get any value out of it by foreclosing, that we will work with that farm or work with that bank or work with that business so that we can get it back to something that has a chance of paying us back, versus if a farm was operating and making payments and had equity and had value that could be attained, they shut the doors on those farms because they got what they could at the time. And frankly, it ticked me off. It made me mad. And to see what was happening at that time, I took that to Iowa State and worked on a couple of projects in the journalism department at Iowa State that I was really proud of at the time, still am, that kind of exposed a lot of how the farm crisis was more of a savings and loans crisis than it was on the farm. And all these savings and loans did was they just kicked the problem further down, and it in some cases it was just flat out theft that happened.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that people understood that. I wanted to make sure that, and one of the things that intrigued me about Pro Farmer, which started, by the way, in 1973, with the mission of leveling the playing field between the grain buyers and farmers, so that farmers would have the same information that the grain companies did when they were making business decisions. the decisions that are going to influence, how successful their business is going to be for that year. So that was the kind of service-based journalism, I think, that I was most interested in.
Service-based journalism. I like that. So I want to talk about how reporting has changed, but you gotta. That's the '80s version of that song "Richmond, North of Richmond" was playing in my head when I heard you talking about this. Right, is detached from decisions and things that really affect people in rural America and in their homes. And now it's 2023, so we're a long way away from '81. There's fewer people in these communities. We need to find ways to continue to strengthen. So what's changed? What's changed since then? Is your audience bigger? Is it smaller? Is it more or less important? Where are we at now in 2023, taking that spirit of '81 and that what you talked about? What's changed? What's the same? And I guess what gets you mad right now, Chip?
It is the same. Yeah, no, it is. It's a lot different now. I guess what gets me mad now is the willingness of our leadership to just flat out lie to you. Just treat you like you don't know any better. And that happens, and it comes from both parties. Okay.
Yeah.
This is not a partisan gripe. This is across the parties. There are way too many people in leadership positions that are just flat out willing to lie. And issues don't matter as much as party. What's right doesn't matter as much as supporting your party line. And we got to find a way out of this. It's been said before, but it is swampy. It is swampy north of Richmond. And
yeah.
It needs to get cleaned out.
Well, I was thinking there was a study, and I'm sure somebody will Google it and find it when they hear this, but there's some interesting things. The founders, they put DC in the swamp, so a lot of things wouldn't happen. So things would happen closer to the people. So it's a lot harder to lie to people you have to look at every day, right?
Yeah.
Proximity breeds responsibility. But if you look at when air conditioning was invented and used, and the amount of legislation and power and things that started coming out of DC, you can now live and thrive in the swamp. And so there's interesting things like that where people saw what was coming, and we still make maybe some of the mistakes. I guess that's human nature.
Yeah.
But I have a passion for this too, because I think about how important it is to have thriving farms that produce great food, good food supply for our country and for the world.
Yep.
And I think about how small of a group we've become, yet how important it is to our country. And I think that's why some of your reporting and the work that you do is so critical. How much of it do you see is talking to an audience that understands this like us versus talking to an audience that doesn't understand it but needs to be aware of the importance? How do you look at that as a journalist?
Well, as a broadcast journalist, see, and I still write a column in Farm Journal as the Farm Journal economist.
Okay.
And in that column, I avoid dumbing it down in that format, because if someone's reading Farm Journal magazine, they're coming for information, and it's an intelligent group, I think, that we are servicing with that magazine. And on AgriTalk, sometimes I need to take a route that is
circuitous.
Yes, yeah, because I want to make sure that the background is understood as much as how we got to the point that we're at. That
Right.
needs to be understood, not only for the farm listeners, but for the non-farm listeners that are listening out there. And then when it comes to here's what it means for us going forward, then I feel like I'm talking more directly to farmers, because they're the ones that are going to have to use or that will use the information to make important decisions with. So I'll talk more directly to farmers when we talk future. When we talked about how we got here, I talk a little bit more general. For the for Pro Farmer Newsletter, when I was writing that thing, which was a weekly publication.
Yep.
The same editor, Bob Kaufman, that I talked to in high school and in college, had a great line. He says, "Less of how it came to be and more of what it means to me." That just played over and over and over again in my head as I was writing Pro Farmer Newsletter. I'd give 2 or 3 lines of background and then move on to, here's why it's important to you and here's what you should do about it. So it's a little bit different. It's quite a bit different on AgriTalk now, but I've enjoyed both for sure.
It's an art to balance those things and get to that point. But you've got quite the following, quite the audience. Your content's incredibly valuable. Before I ask you about technology, and then we're going to move to that number and Pro Farmer Crop Tour.
Yeah, okay.
I want to. So you do a lot of content. You're preparing a lot of things. I know you have your own broadcast medium, but for our audience, what's top of mind? Like, what's the thing that people need to know right now that you're writing about, talking about, broadcasting? What's the most important thing you've come across recently that people need to know and why?
Okay. Very, very timely question, because I kind of designed this morning show and this afternoon show.
Okay.
We do 2 shows a day. And we're, by the way, it is a podcast and it is available in a podcast form. It's also a radio show.
Okay.
We've got about 110 affiliate stations around the Midwest, most of them in the 12 Midwest states, that AgriTalk is on twice a day, 1006 and 206. So, but we talked in both the morning show and the afternoon show. The morning show, we talk policy, we talk issues, the news of the day. We'll have the newsmakers on. The afternoon is pretty much all about markets and what it means. We talked a lot about China today.
Okay.
The crop problems that they're having is what gets the conversation started. But eventually you come around to the slow economic growth. And this afternoon in the conversation with Craig Turner from StoneX Group, we got into the population projections and how the demographics are going to be changing in China over the next 30, 40 years and what that might mean to overall demand. That population could fall to under 1 billion people by the time we get to 2050, 2055.
That's quite a drop. But today, if I'm correct, China has 20% of the global population, but only 7% of the world's arable land, right?
Yeah, so, something like that. Yeah.
So that changes kind of how we look at it, how we work. How does that play into this? Does that, even though the population is dropping, do they still hold that kind of percentage of demand, or is the protein diet still going to need to be enriched and we still need more resource? What does that look like over the next 30 or 40 years? Not to steal from your show, but just...
No, that's great. As the population pulls back, think about what that does to the workforce out there. That workforce is going to be in higher demand. Cheap labor that we import from China in the trinkets that we get, that cheap labor is going to go away. So they're moving more and more into the middle class, smaller population, bigger middle class, more buying power. And what are they? They're going to spend money on food. So even though the population is going to be getting smaller in China, demand for protein in particular, I think, is going to be very good. Very good.
So, yeah, that's amazing how interconnected these things are. So China pays a lot of attention, particularly the U.S. and Brazil markets, for these inputs, correct?
Yes. Oh, yeah. And they showed when they had the problem with their hog herd and the African swine fever, and called a lot of the sows and really saw a dramatic cut in their ability to produce pork. They did show a willingness to use the import market and to import some of that protein. And I think over time, that's probably going to become more and more important to China. And you can't just say China. It's going to be Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
It's going to become more and more important to for those countries to import proteins, and countries like the U.S., Brazil, even Australia are going to be in a really good position to facilitate some of that demand and provide that demand. I mean, look at the way that our crush industry is going to be changing here, Mike, with the renewable diesel and the sustainable aviation fuel. If that push continues, I think it probably will, especially for the renewable diesel, because it's state initiatives rather than federal initiatives that are kind of driving that thing. Mm-hmm. So, we're building up our crush capacity so that we can produce more soybean oil to produce more renewable diesel. That's going to leave us with a whole lot of soybean meal that if we can put it in a pig or put it in a dairy cow or put it into beef and ship some of that overseas, I think that's a winner. I should have said poultry too. I mean,
yeah,
dadgum broilers, nothing more than a soybean with a beak. And if we can increase our poultry exports, boy, that's a big winner for us.
These dynamics are pretty interesting. And some of these pull against each other, right? Because you've got crops to go into making food versus fuel, what that means. I don't know what this means for pricing. What I'm hearing is food everywhere is going to get more expensive here in the future, unless we figure out how to produce more from less, and that gets into technology. So
yeah,
we were just talking about 1981, 1973. Now we're here in 2023. What do you see? Like, there's been a lot of changes in tech, and we could probably go through a few pivotal ones. As you think about these trends and changes, what technologies have made the biggest impact, and where do we have room really to make even more impact and improvement with tech going forward?
Yeah, the seed tech, I think, is really, really high on this list. The ability to manage some of the pests and manage some of the issues, including, a corn plant's ability to withstand a period of hot and dry weather better. And some of that is traditional plant breeding too. I get that.
Yeah.
But just, BT corn back in 1997, good grief. It changed the world. We were running the crop tour, started running the crop tour in 1993. And even in a year like 1994, which was one of the best crops that I can remember from crop tour, we were starting to see that corn crop shut down in the third week of August just because of corn borer issues. The plant was opened up to disease. You broke the seal.
Yep.
And so it shuts down. When that BT corn, when it kept that environment inside of the plant sealed for as long as it did, and all of a sudden we're looking at green stalks with white husks late in the season, it blew me away. It still blows me away to see it. And I think that was just so unbelievably important piece of technology for us, man. It was crazy. and looking forward, I think technology is probably going to be most significant in solving some of our labor issues, right? Mm-hmm. Automation, I think, is coming. What you guys do is save. It's knocking hours out of a season for guys. So technology, I think, is going to will focus most intently on solving some of the labor issues that we've got in agriculture.
Yeah. Labor, then understanding how these other technologies, what's correlated to great success, to maximum output, good economic return, which traits, which management practices. I don't think we've, as a industry, we've not really put together all those ingredients in a systematic way so we can make those improvements, but we're on the way, right? That's the point. So many changes from 80s, 90s to where we are. Now, you said something is when you started the Pro Farmer Crop Tour, and then you saw things. So we're not getting to the number yet, but let's just open this up. What is the Pro Farmer Crop Tour, Chip?
Okay. Pro Farmer Crop Tour was actually started in the 1970s by the Illinois Farm Bureau.
Okay.
And Illinois Farm Bureau just did it across the state of Illinois. Jim Quinton was a private crop consultant I'm not even sure when Jim took it over from Illinois Farm Bureau, but Jim expanded it to include Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and most of Iowa. And every now and then somebody would sneak up into Minnesota and pull a few samples on that tour as well.
Okay.
So Jim then ran it until 1993. I started going on crop tour in 1988 as a reporter, a wire service reporter. So I met Jim, I got to know Jim, and Jim got to know me. And it was just something that it was, even though it was much smaller than it is today, it was too big of an effort for Jim and his wife, Kathy, to handle, to do. And he wanted to see the tour continue. We wanted to see the tour continue at Pro Farmer. And so I worked with Jim in 1992, and then 93 was the first year that Pro Farmer ran the tour. We ran basically the same routes that Jim did for the first couple of years. And then we started to expand it because we wanted to include more of Iowa. So we started playing with the routes and moving things around. And then in 1996, we started an effort to add the Western Corn Belt, South Dakota, Nebraska, make it easier to get to Western Iowa. And then we wanted to do more of Minnesota as well. So we started working on that. And every time I mention this, I got to say their names, Steve Carr and Terry Johnston. These two guys were employees of Pro Farmer. And they went out and busted their butts for 2 years, 1996 and 1997, to gather groundwork so that we would have something that we could compare to when we went out on tour for the first time in the Western Belt in 1998. So I led that tour out west in 1998 and started Scott Davis, who is now at Bullpen Trading, or owns Bullpen Trading up in Rochester, was working with us at that time, and he was leading the eastern leg of the tour. And ever since then, we've had the split tour. The first time that we did it in 1993, I met the guys in Dayton, Ohio. I think there was 18 of us. We ran 9 routes for the evening meal. We'd buy pizza and put a box of beer in the middle of the table and sit around and talk about what we saw that day. And then I would go to my room and enter all the data that we collected that day. At that time, over the course of 4 days, we would collect, maybe 500 samples, something like that. It wasn't a huge number. It was a significant number, and it was the number that the markets paid attention to. But it wasn't nearly what it is today. So that was a lot of fun. But when Farm Journal bought Pro Farmer in 1998, it was time to step this thing up. And we've got a much larger platform, a much bigger soapbox. Let's blow this thing up. Let's start to find out exactly what we can do with it and how much interest there was in going to a crop tour meeting. So we started to develop that in 2000, and it's basically been getting bigger and bigger ever since. I mean, we last year on the final night of the crop tour, we had over 1,000 people in the room in Rochester, and it's pretty phenomenal to see what it's turned into. But we'll have 350 people in Grand Island, 300 in Nebraska City, 700 up in Spencer. Brian will be looking at upwards of 900 people at Coralville or Iowa City on Wednesday night before he gets to Rochester. Smaller groups, but still large. I mean, 250 to 300 people in in Indianapolis and in Bloomington, leading up to that big meeting in Iowa City. So, and now the last couple of years, we've pulled about 1,700 corn samples, 1,700 soybean samples. And we do that by running 10 different routes on the western leg. We run 12 different routes on the eastern leg. We split up into groups of 3 or 4 teams of 3 or 4 people, and put those people in a vehicle. And it's gotten to the point that we're now able to split a lot of the routes, and that's why all of a sudden we went from pulling 1,500 routes or even 1,400 samples over the 4 days to pulling 1,700 samples, because we have 2 cars working the routes. One car will do half the route, the other car will do the other half. And it is amazing to see how the information comes together. And we've done it the same way ever since when I was out on crop tour in 1988. We do it the same way. And that's what makes the data valuable. We keep it consistent year to year. We keep the sampling procedure the same. We bring as much randomness into it as we possibly can. And it creates this consistent randomness that puts value into the data. And it's really cool.
Yeah. So you're talking about samples. And by the way, there's a lot of numbers you mentioned. Those, I assume, are not the number that people...
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. We're going to wait. And I'm waiting. I'm being patient. My heartbeat was getting up there a little bit, the more numbers I was waiting to see what it was going to be. So you talk about these samples, and year over year, it is systematic. Okay, so what's your primary goal? It's to provide the industry with growing season information about likely corn and soybean yields. So how do these samples, how does the tour, if I've got that right, how does it do that? And what does it mean to me? Right?
Okay.
We talked about how to get there. What does it mean to me and our listeners?
Okay. So the process, I think, is important here. Like I've been talking about the different routes. We go down the road every 15 to 20 miles. It depends on how much ground you've got to cover that day. By the corn and soybean field that are close to each other. We get past the end rows in a cornfield and go 35 paces down the main rows and set up a 30-foot plot, 2 30-foot plots of corn. We count all the ears that will make grain on the 2 rows. Then from one of the rows, we pull the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th ear. From those ears, the data that we collect is the length of grain in inches. We don't measure the tip back. We don't count the kernels. We measure the length of grain in inches. We count the number of kernel rows around the ear. We measure the row spacing in that field. So once we've got the ear population, the grain length in inches, the number of kernel rows around on averages, and the row width in the field, we've got the information that we need to calculate an average yield. We do that in one spot on that field. If we get it right, it's because we were in the average spot in that field.
Right.
It's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is pull 1,700 samples from one big Midwestern cornfield that will give us an idea of what the final yield will be. The amount of time that we spend in a state, the areas that we cover in a state, all helps to weight that appropriately. So we spend a half a day in South Dakota. We spend a half a day in Ohio. Okay. We don't collect as many samples out of Indiana as we collect out of Illinois or Iowa. It used to be that we got very few samples out of Minnesota. Minnesota is either the third or fourth biggest corn producing state. The number of samples that we pull out of Minnesota is very similar to the number of samples that we pull from Nebraska. So the routes, the time that we spend, all of that stuff weights the sampling procedure for us out there. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool the way that it all comes together. Now on soybeans, we find a representative spot in the field. We don't march off past the end rows and go 35 paces. Find a representative spot in the soybean field, measure 3 foot of row, count all the plants in that 3 foot of row, and then pull 3 plants at random. We'll count all the pods on those 3 plants, calculate the average, then the average number of pods per plant times the number of plants per row gives you the total number of pods in that 3 foot of row. Then, to make it possible to compare a 30-inch rowed bean to a 15-inch row to a 7.5-inch drilled, we take the number of pods in 3 foot of row times 36 and divided by the row width. Therefore, we've got the number of pods in a 3 by 3 foot square. There's no hula hoops. There's no squares. That's always, been part of how other people explain what we do when we're out there on crop tour, that we've got a hula hoop that we just throw, and then we count all the pods that are inside of that hula hoop. No, there's never been not that I'm aware of, there's never been a hula hoop on crop tour. It's all done the same way, and it was all started. That procedure was started by Illinois Farm Bureau as well, and really what that does is it doesn't give us a yield, but it gives us an idea of how much of the production factory is up and running on the bean crop that year. Okay.
Yep. So for those that are going to attend, and I want you to tell a little bit more about the Pro Farmer Crop Tour, we've got it coming up. You've got 2 legs, east and west, starting, right? So August 21st, I think, is the starting date. Noblesville and Grand Island.
Yep.
Indiana's number 5 in corn producing. You're starting out there. Those listening, they should bring hula hoops, is what I heard you say. You want to see lots of hula hoops to these destinations.
No need to bring your hula hoop. Bring a tape measure. And some boots. Yep, that'd be good. So
and it's going to start Noblesville, and then you got Grand Island, and it goes, from there, culminating in Rochester, Minnesota.
Well, the western leg of the tour starts in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Okay.
So day 1 we go through southeast South Dakota and northeast Nebraska, make our way down to Grand Island. So we'll do everything north of the Platte River. Day 2, we go from Grand Island to Nebraska City and cover everything south of the Platte River. Day 3 on the western leg is the western 3 crop tour districts in Iowa, crop districts 1, 4, and 7, and we make our way to Spencer, Iowa.
Okay.
And that's the last tour. That's the last sample that the western leg will pull out of Iowa. That happens on Wednesday. Thursday, we go up into Minnesota and make our way over to Rochester. The eastern leg of the tour starts in Columbus and makes their way over to Noblesville.
Okay.
And then Noblesville to Bloomington, Bloomington to Iowa City, and Iowa City to Rochester to meet up with us from the west. Okay. So two different groups. We've got, it's right at 100 scouts, and they're evenly split between the eastern and the western leg this year. Very evenly split. So more than enough.
So, hey, welcome back here to the AcreForward podcast. You can see that I'm now in a different location. Chip, the excitement over the one number, which we're going to get to, caused a little bit of a power outage. I think we broke Zoom briefly. Kind of like DeSantis breaking Twitter back then. we've got additional servers to back this up, the ones we use to monitor acres. And so now we're ready to go. So I want to back up. You were talking a little bit about the Pro Farmer Crop Tour.
Yeah.
Again, we'll get to the number. So for the audience that's listening, you're getting samples, you get yield estimates. In a nutshell, why should someone attend? What do they need to know? And why is Pro Farmer Crop Tour important, Chip?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's real-time analysis. It's a discovery process, and you got to let it be that discovery process that it is. So as we go out there and collect all the samples each day, we come in, we finalize the data for each state, and then we release that as soon as we've got it available. So it's real-time reporting, it's real-time analysis, and it you can see that the markets pay attention to what we're putting out there. Doesn't always move the markets, and that's not our intention at all. That's just doesn't even come into our thinking when we're out there. But when it does happen, we pay attention to it, we respect it, we treat it with the thick gloves that we need to treat it with.
That's really great. So it's coming up, and we were talking about one number.
Right.
If I want to attend this, what do I need to do? How do I need to know about it? And again, let's get towards that number that we teased at the beginning of the program here.
You bet. Okay, the best way to attend at this point forward is to get registered for the 8 o'clock. Well, actually, we're going to start streaming at 7:57 p.m. Central Time. The reason that we do that is because we embargo the release of the data that we have each day until 8 o'clock p.m. But get online, go to profarmer.com, find the registration for the evening's stream, and then we should be able to, and if you go from there, profarmer.com/register, it should take you right to where you need to be for the, there it is right there, /register. So get signed up for the evening stream. There may be some room left at a couple of the meetings on the eastern leg of the tour, but I think the western leg is pretty much filled up to capacity. So that's
great. We'll have the links in our show notes so people can get to the Pro Farmer Tour. I think get yourself to profarmer.com, follow Chip on AgriTalk, these other places, and there's great ways for you to interact, know what's happening in these results. So now, this number, we talked about a lot of numbers today, 1,700, this, or this. What is this number that you're talking about with regard to Pro Farmer Crop Tour?
Okay. And this is a number that will be used as Pro Farmer puts together their crop estimate for corn. You take all the samples from all 7 states, you put them into one spreadsheet, and we've got two yield calculations that are driven by the same data set. The one calculation is an adjustment that tries to account for the size of kernels based on the number of kernel rows around the ear. It was terrible. It's the old crop tour calculation, and it didn't work with today's genetics and with today's management. So I think it was 2005, Mike, we went back and back tested all the data and just decided that we needed to take that adjustment off. But doesn't mean that we still don't look at that number, at least internally. So when we take all 1,700 and we run the adjusted yield calculation with the yield calculation that will be reported throughout the week, and then take the average of those two numbers,
yes,
that's going to get you really close to what the national average corn yield is going to be.
And this is something we can come back and look back on and verify, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So this magic number, this number that comes from all these data points, the Pro Farmer Tour, now that's a lot of math. My degree is in political science, so I'm going to believe you. But we're going to take all of this math. You're going to arrive at an estimate, at a number. And you're saying at the end of the year, when the USDA and everybody finishes up, it's going to line up to the national average.
The goal is to be within 1%.
1%. So here now, I'd like to have you back here when we get there and actually drive through those numbers. If you will. But that's quite a claim that tells me that if I'm farming and corn and beans are important to me, that I need to pay attention to Pro Farmer Crop Tour. I need to be part of this because I want to get a sneak peek and an early understanding of the potential here what's happening here in corn and soybeans.
Exactly. And Mike, the other thing on this that I haven't mentioned yet is I think it was 3 years ago, USDA stopped doing the objective yield data sampling in their field, their yield plots.
Okay.
So this is the first broad-based effort to go out and pull the husk back and take a look at what's under the husk. So this is it's an important, in my opinion, it's an important event for the industry.
Well, obviously, and especially we have changes like that, any of these data points are helpful. That's what we think about every day is how do we understand better about what we're doing? We talked about the advances in equipment and traits and chemistry. We have so many things that help us, but what we haven't done and we can do now with the new technologies like what we do with the AcreForward technology, like what you're doing, we can take these data points and we really can understand, like game tape for your acre, how does the weather, how does your management practice, what are you doing? How did you perform? How did the hybrid perform? What decisions can we take? And what do we need to continue to do? What do we need to stop doing? And that's probably a very local field by field decision. But now in 2023, Chip, we live in a world where we can actually do that and record that, not just from machines, but from the sky and with efforts like what you're talking about. So I think it's going to get better and better every year, but it's a very unique time to be living because I think we're just at the beginning of true advancement in yield and productivity.
Yep. Very cool. Very cool, Mike.
Very cool. So before we wrap up this extended version of the AcreForward podcast, where I actually did a wardrobe change here to wrap up here the meeting, what else is on your mind, Chip, that you want our listeners to know, and any closing thoughts here today?
We haven't talked a whole lot about soybeans. The soybean balance sheet is tight.
Okay.
And the weather during crop tour week and the week after, I think, is really going to tell us just how this soybean crop is going to perform. A bushel per acre in either direction on the soybean yield from USDA's number in August makes a huge difference in the outlook for that soybean market. And if it's going to make a big difference on soybeans, of course, it'll have an impact on what that corn market is going to do as well. So there's more vulnerability to price moves coming out of this tour for soybeans, I think, than there is on corn.
Why is the soybean balance sheet so tight for our viewers and listeners? What's going on that's creating that dynamic?
It's number one thing is acres. We just didn't get as many soybean acres, or as many acres planted to soybeans as we expected for 2023. Those acres went to corn, and it looks like there could even be some acres added to the corn plantings for 2023 yet. But soybean acres may be up just a little bit, 100,000, maybe 200,000, but not enough to move the needle. So when we're looking at the lower acres without a record yield, without a 52 bushel per acre national average yield,
right,
we're just not adding enough back to the supply side to get things comfortable. We've already pulled the demand expectations back on 2023-24, but with that crush capacity that's coming on, Mike, you can't lean on the demand side of the bean market too hard because you'll make a mistake doing that. So instead of a 350 million bushel carry, instead of 300 million bushel, we're probably looking at something south of 250 million bushels, and it's going to be real easy to slide under 200 million bushels if we would lose a bushel across the country.
Wow, that's pretty major. So the earliest we can know that and understand that can help us make some of the right decisions now and for next year, which is why ProFarmer Crop Tour can also be really critical to anybody making decisions now on grain or for next season, what they need to be doing.
That's right. Good stuff.
Absolutely great stuff. Yeah, so we're here in August. We're already thinking about what we're planning for next year and decisions we're making. Many of the folks listening to this have already made or are making their decisions of, what they want to do and change for next season. I think anybody hearing this, and I do want to thank Chip really for your time and your expertise, and I can't wait to do this again and check those estimates. But everybody that's listening to this, whether you're an advisor, a grower, or both, working together, they all know how to get a hold and listen to Chip Flory, whether it's AgriTalk, ProFarmer, Farm Journal. It's really great to have you here, and want to thank you for joining us here today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
So I want to thank our audience again for joining the discussion. And here, when we say AcreForward, we're talking about a passion to drive and see more value from every acre. ProFarmer Crop Tour is certainly going to do that. Go check that out at profarmer.com. Also, we understand that every acre tells a story. And here at Taranis and with AcreForward Technologies, we help illustrate it, but you're the author of your own success. So if you want to learn more and see more stories like Chip Flory's story and others, check us out at AcreForwardPodcast.com. Thank you.